and presentation. So first, I will mention that I'm working for Energy Cities, the European Association of Local Authorities in Energy Transition. I'm working on different projects related to energy systems at local level. And today we have the chance to have experts from two projects. So one project is a fossil-free energy district project, which is a urban innovative action project. And the other project is the Heat Roadmap Europe project, which is a H2020 project. So the expert of today are Klaas, is head of projects at Johan Berg Science Park, responsible for a portfolio of projects related to energy and sustainability, and is also the project coordinator of the FED project. We have also the chance to have Håkon. He has worked for 20 years in finance and management in different companies before moving to the energy sector. Now he's working in this sector for more than 15 years and is senior advisor in different projects, as for example, divesting some of daughter's company of Gothenburg Energy. We also have the chance to have Lars, who is a Public Affairs Officer at Gothenburg Energy. His main areas of focus are energy-related policy instruments, especially concerning district heating and environmental system issue and how the energy systems interact with the built environment. And finally, our last expert is Daniel. He has joined the consultancy Plan Energy in 2010 and is head of department at Plan Energy's office in Copenhagen. In the past years, he has had a main focus on international projects to facilitate an intelligent energy system transition, and he has been involved in all 4 Heat Roadmap Europe projects. He is specialized in simulation of energy systems, including the impact of fluctuating renewable energy supply. So we will hear our expert in a few minutes. First, I would like to mention that the topic of today is of real importance. Recently, in the 4th report on the state of the Energy Union published last week by the European Commission, it's clearly mentioned that local authorities face constraints in their ability to design policy. At the European level, the new clean energy package adopted last year changed the policy rules. And for example, the Renewable Energy Directive gives the right to renewable energy communities to share and trade energy. This will be implemented in 2021. And of course, we hope that it will help tapping local and renewable energies first and empowering people so that they become active actors in the energy system. And it's really important. It's also the case for the heating and cooling sector. And to do so, multi-energy smart grids and district heating and cooling are key technology. Everyone is speaking about sector and energy coupling, like electricity, heat, and cold coupling, but in practice, it's still quite new. And district heating and cooling will have an important role to play to have an integrated energy system. And we see at the local level that the local heating and cooling production is lagging behind compared to electricity. And for example, among the signatories of the Covenant of Mayors, who have submitted a monitoring report of their action plans, the local heating and cooling production increased by 44% compared to the local electricity production, which increased by 80%. So the increase is 2 times more important for electricity than for heating and cooling. And to foster the development of multi-energy smart district, as well as heating and cooling district, the legal framework are needed at the local level so that the cities can better implement their strategic energy plan. And we will now hear our experts, and I will give first the floor to Klaas, who is going to present the FED project. So we will give the floor to Klaas and the control of the screen.
Thank you, Julian. I will start with just a quick introduction to our project, FED, or Fossil Free Energy District, and then Lars and Håkan will continue more in detail with the policy recommendations. The project FED is developing a local marketplace for both electricity, heating, and district cooling as well. And we have a great opportunity to do this in the campus of Johannesburg, where the University of Chalmers is located in Gothenburg, because in this area we have a local district heating grid with a temperature of about 70 degrees. We also have a local district cooling grid and a local electrical grid. And these grids are also connected to the overlaying systems of Gothenburg Energy. And from the beginning, there are also local production facilities, such as a small combined heat and power plant fueled by mainly biochips, but also various kinds of local production, such as solar PVs and heat pumps that recovers heat from the cooling system back to the district heating system as well. So in a way, we can see this as a local system, how we can operate a district in the city, but we can also explore in this project if we will scale up this solution to cover the whole city of Gothenburg. How can that work as well? The aim is to optimize the use of energy storages and other flexible facilities in the system. And of course, one aspect is the combination of several utilities, how you can shift loads between heating and cooling in also to the electrical sector with this. We have an aim to avoid import of energy when there are fossil fuel peaks in the grid. The system of Gothenburg is actually rather fossil-free already, but perhaps 20% still comes from fossil sources in the district heating system. And this is a way to help to reduce the last parts to reach the target of Gothenburg to reach 100% free of oil and gas in the system until 2030. And there's also a way to reduce the need of primary energy, while we, with this system, can also, for example, recover heat from the buildings and from computer centers and things back to the district heating system with these lower temperature systems. As mentioned, we're financed by the program Urban Innovative Actions, and for this project we have a budget of about 5.8 million euros. And there are also another aspect of this project that is in line with the scope of Urban Innovative Actions. We do this project with a specific result here in Gothenburg, but it's also a way to try to create a kind of urban lab in these kind of questions of how to integrate actually all kinds of local production and different local storages of both electricity, heating and cooling in the system. And we will continue this test bed further on as well. We're 9 partners involved: City of Gothenburg, Johannesburg Science Park, where I work. We're in lead of this project. 2 real estate owners, Akademiska Hus, Chalmers Fastigheter. And then we have the researchers of the University of Chalmers and RISE in Sweden, working mainly with modeling and how to plan for design of this marketplace. We have Ericsson, the ICT company, that's also have a big office here in Gothenburg, that has actually converted the ideas from the researchers on the others in the project to an IoT solution for this project. And Göteborg Energy will speak more later of the role in the project. Of course, the local utility company is very important in this business. And Business Region Gothenburg is also a company within the city of Gothenburg, helping to promote the business and looking into replication of the FED system. We address the energy transition, of course, in the EU as the program in Urban Innovative Actions. The secure energy supply is, of course, a part of this as well, with small-scale solutions and IoT aspects. Smart systems of various kinds. Also, one aspect, for example, in Sweden, it's not only fossil-free, but also renewable production. Since Sweden is in the phase of removing a lot of nuclear plants that's very old in the system and replacing them with wind and solar. And of course, sustainable business models is an aspect when we look at it from a market perspective. we see each partner, each house actually in this system as a market participant and evaluate the value for each of those. This is a picture of the total system that we divide in. I think we have approximately 50 different market participants in the system. Locals, such as the external grids. For example, the district heating system, in this case, Gothenburg Energy, promotes an hourly based pricing on district heating. And actually all these market participants place bids on the market each hour. And they place bids saying how much energy they need or how much they can produce for the next coming 10 hours. And this is running all the time, 24/7. And actually the system has been up and running since January, full time, starting with perhaps half of the market participants. And now in a month or so, we will have everything up and running. And we will evaluate this for 1 year and also add different functions such as services to the electrical grid, for example, frequency regulations with batteries and things like that. Here is the overall time schedule. We started in November 2016. We have the design set in summer 2017, and successfully we step by step actually we developed this trading system and put it into operation. And now we will have the final conference in Brussels in October. But we still also will have this project open 1 more year to share knowledge from it. And by that I leave to Lars.
Thank you. In Fed, there's a work package dealing with replication. How can we replicate what we have been doing here at the Chalmers campus? And by replication, we mean using this intelligent infrastructure on the market platform, etc., etc. And that work package took their conclusions to another work package dealing with policy recommendations, where we tried to transform these insights into recommendations for policymakers. Which one? Thank you. Doesn't work. Very good. So we're having one slide for each, and we don't have to dig into these here now. The first, why is it not working when I'm using it? Thank you. The first one we call Strive for Social Acceptance, because we realize that there's a lot of people involved in this project as users of it, and without proper knowledge of what is actually happening, it will be very hard to get social acceptance. We need to have people involved in it. And I think one thing that we have to realize is that this flexibility in the energy system sometimes means not more freedom for the consumer, but it means less. It means that someone is taking over control over your house or your office space or whatever. And we need to realize that, and we need to accept it in order to have this working properly. And sometimes we're not really there yet. Okay?
Okay, Håkan here. Since the replication of Fed is directed to cities, so are the proposed financing and economic incentives for the cities. The problem is that the cities have too high emissions of CO2, and the implementation gap is that there are no clear financial investment or economic incentives that are directed to the cities in Europe to invest in solutions that aims to reduce CO2 emissions, like Fed-like solutions. So therefore, the policy recommendation is from financing and economic incentive to cities when they invest in replication in Fed-like solutions. The financing is the policy recommendation that you, in the framework of the European Investment Bank strategy for you direct investments to the cities to invest in tools like Fed-like solutions for 50% of the investment. The rest 50%, the cities themselves, how do you call it, have green bonds to finance the rest part of it. The second part of the policy recommendation is to design incentives for the cities, and one proposed policy there is to introduce a carbon dioxide fund, and the fund can finance. Now I lost my line here. The money from the fund, that the fund is financed by taxes from the European countries, and the money from the fund can be directed to cities when they can show that they reduce emissions from CO2. So that's the policy recommendation of the finance and economic side.
Okay, thank you. Now it's back to Lars again. Another message we have is that we need to highlight the role of a city or the municipality in this process of making local energy plans and local energy communities, because there is a risk of sub-optimization if we divide the city into smaller parts and having them work for themselves. Mainly these sub-optimizations have to do with different taxation schemes. One example is if you have a very small local energy community with one house with solar panels. If you do that in Sweden, and if you invest in a battery, which is a very smart thing to do, you will have incentives to actually preserve your electricity, save it in the battery during the daytime while the electricity prices are high, and to use that electricity when you get home in the evening, despite the fact that the electricity prices then are lower and there is a less shortage of electricity than during the daytime. This is because it's more profitable to me, because I save consumption taxes and I save grid fees. And we need to be aware of what kind of conflicts we might come up with when we do this. It's a bit of a controversial thing to say, because local energy communities is a very popular thing to discuss right now, but we need to have open eyes on this, I think. Next recommendation is to enable the DSO, the distribution system operator, like the grid company in the city, to be more active, to trade in flexibility in various ways. Typically within Sweden and within European regulation, the DSO is meant to be a very passive actor, as passive as possible, merely owning the infrastructure but not doing much else. But since we have a problem locally, which may not be the same problems as in the larger grid, the national grid, for instance, the DSO needs to have power to solve the local problems as well, and the legislation for that is not really in place. With the new electricity directive, things are improving, but we haven't really seen how this directive is being implemented in national legislation yet. So this is an important issue to keep our eyes on. Last is to enable the possibility to test and make demos of the Fed solution in several places. Because Fed, as Claes described it, we actually introduce many things into this. We have a very interesting energy system with lots of things in it. We have solar panels, we have storage, we have our own production, and we can import both electricity and district heating. While essentially the third project is about this smart solution of establishing this market thing. Enabled to see what is the gains of the market aspect rather than just the different physical things. We need to have several demonstrations in different circumstances in order to evaluate the value of the Fed, which to me is to do what you can with the things that you have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now, so we don't have, sorry, we don't have any question now on the chat. So I think we will go for the presentation of Daniel about Heat Roadmap Europe project, and then we will take all the question at the end.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So as mentioned, my name is Daniel Trier, and briefly about the Heat Roadmap Europe project. We've analyzed and modeled 14 countries in the EU towards 2050 in terms of the energy system as a whole, including transport, with a focus on the heating and cooling sector. And we revealed some synergies between three main pillars, as described here on the screen. Energy savings, which is an important topic here as well, efficient low carbon energy supply, and thermal networks. And what we can see is that there are several synergies when you combine the three in an intelligent way. One conclusion here is actually that you can actually decarbonize the heating and cooling sector by means of existing technologies. We don't use CCS, we don't add more nuclear. Actually, we have less nuclear by 2050. So we don't have to wait for new technologies to be developed. This is something we can start doing right now. And what we did is developing three guidelines on recommendations for the energy system transition. So we have one on an international level, then we have 14 meaning one per country. And on national level, that is one report, but with sections for the 14 countries. And then we have one on a more local level, where we have a more practical approach, zooming in a bit on the regions. One of the outcomes of the project I should mention perhaps is also the PETA map, which is an online tool where you can zoom in and see, for example, heat demand densities on hectare level. You have various heat supply options, and also cost estimations of extending district heating or applying district heating in new areas. So that's becoming a quite useful tool, actually. So in terms of the recommendations, so this is just a picture of the one of the reports. I've listed some key points here. I won't go into all the details, but raising awareness is one thing you can do as a local authority or national authority. Well, and of course, making sure that we have the professionals skilled enough to apply the different solutions that you want to promote. Removing administrative barriers, making sure that it's somewhat easy to go in the decarbonization direction for industries and utilities. And then requiring an integrated energy planning at all levels. In some countries, it's been done in decades, that you're making long-term planning for how can we lower the CO2 emissions. And then making sure that you have this kind of approach, that we make sure that we all work in that direction and then continuously update those plans. I'll come back to that. CO2 taxation and on European level, the ETS system is not really reflecting the actual cost of emissions. So there's something to do there. And also stopping fossil fuel subsidies and phasing out fossil fuels. And a low-hanging fruit in that content is to ban installation of fossil fuel boilers in new buildings, and making expiry dates for fossil fuel power productions. Again, this is about making sure that we have long-term strategies. We all know this is a thing we need to do and need to have an end date of all the fossil fuel power production, for example. And of course, public financing to support the low carbon solutions. And as a local authority, you might think, well, this is national or even international legislation. I can't decide that, but you can sometimes focus on what is possible to change. One thing is that you can push your national politicians to work in the right direction, but there's also things that can be done on a more local level. And one of the things is to bring stakeholders together and making a common narrative. For example, energy utilities, both electricity and district heating, for example, the industries of the area, and then with the local authority as facilitator or administrator. And if you form a common goal, for example, to neutrality by year X, then you can make sure that this is something everyone involved in the municipality, for example, everyone knows that this is something we work towards. So you cannot suddenly say, well, now I decided I don't want to focus on CO2 emissions anymore. I don't want to work in that direction because we have a new board of directors, for example. If it's a common framework, if it's a common narrative that everyone in this municipality, local citizens, industries, utilities, and the public authority, everyone works in the same direction, then it's also easier to make sure that there's a positive atmosphere around the different challenges that you also include in this. And one thing to keep in mind is also that business as usual, in my opinion, is also a choice. I've talked to district heating companies who are reluctant to invest in low carbon solutions. And these are actually the ones with the highest cost today. On the other hand, the utilities which dare to invest in low carbon solutions is actually the ones benefiting from that today, having the lowest cost for their consumers. So you need to consider that if you choose to keep business as usual, well, you also choose to accept a cost of fossil fuels, accept the emissions also on a local level, and you might be worse off in the future where the world around you is transferring to a low carbon society. So if you're not prepared to do that, if you're not prepared for that transition, you might be worse off in the future. Of course, there are some issues with local acceptance when we talk about, for example, large-scale PV systems or wind turbines. And in that process, it's also important to keep a fact-based approach and communication, because in some cases, there could be false claims about future projects spread on social media. Some stories about that this will be horrible, and I've heard that some people might argue. I've heard that you get sick from listening to the wind turbines or something. Well, put the facts on the table and have a public communication, a transparent process, so you can make sure that you can discuss the things up front instead of keeping it in small forums where stories are spread around. Sometimes it's also possible to identify ambassadors, and so people who are positive in terms of the project. So maybe raise their voice and put them up front to argue that it's not every citizen who are against this. This might change the mind of some people who are in doubt. Fourth thing is that you could also make sure that that the local neighbors might get an opportunity to invest in a project with a small share, which could mean that they suddenly are co-owners and actually feel like it's a positive thing that the wind is blowing and you make money from the wind turbine instead of just being annoyed by the fact that you have to look at it. And again, as a very bottom point here, if you can raise the point that, or keep a narrative that we're all part of this, meaning that we have to accept these kind of challenges that is also part of the energy transition, because we're all part of this, then it might be easier to accept and get a public acceptance from citizens. Then coming to a more, let's say, general thing on national level. Some politicians might be afraid to put taxation on which might affect the competitiveness of their industries. So they think it's a good idea to promote the green energy transition, but they are afraid to do it because otherwise the industries might be worse off compared to international companies who are not affected by the same kind of taxation. Well, this really calls for international agreements on this, but it's also a matter of considering how industries can be really ready to engage in this energy transition and not only waiting for, say, a point where you get forced to lower your CO2 emissions. Then policies and price signals. As mentioned earlier in this webinar, actually, it's important that incentives promote flexible interaction for consumers, which help balance the electricity grid and not just maximizing the self-consumption of the consumers. I could phrase it in another way by saying the use of renewables is not the end goal. The goal is to lower CO2 emissions. So by having 100% renewable energy supply in one building and 5% in the rest of the neighborhood is really not helpful yet. So we need to consider a holistic approach also in terms of these kind of battery solutions sometimes in the homes. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have any batteries. I'm just saying that it's important that it helps balancing the overall grid, and then you have the flexibility having the TSO to say something, or at least financial incentives to facilitate the balance of the grid and not just maximizing the self-consumption. Then, as mentioned before, I think there should be mandatory energy planning, and this is at all levels. So we really need a long-term strategy for Europe with ambitious targets and not just false claims of 50% renewables is ambitious, but really living up to the Paris Agreement. And national plans as well, which is then in line with what you can do on international level and local level. So it should be energy planning at all levels, which then is aligned with which is on. And one thing I could mention is actually that people sometimes talk about district heating as difficult to apply in practice because, well, you have to dig up the street or connect to a lot of different homes, and they might be reluctant to connect and so on and so forth. And yes, it is maybe a tedious task, but if you can argue that you can lower the energy bill and save CO2 emissions for the people involved in the urban area, and they don't have to consider their heat supply unit and deal with the problems with their boiler or emissions or whatever. If you have a lot of good arguments, I think it should be possible to make a positive connection rate. And we also have actually in the report some recommendations for how that can be done in practice. One thing I could mention in this context is that it has been done in terms of natural gas grids. It's actually the same process that you need to go through. You need to make an overall plan on how to roll out the district heating networks, both on national level and European level, and then apply that at local level. So it should be possible to have, like we have a gas directive, have a district heating directive, and have plans on a national level on how we roll out district heating, because what we see from our study is that we should apply much more district heating than we have today, because it's feasible and it's a good way of making use of some sources which you cannot really use on an individual level. For example, large-scale solar thermal, geothermal, or utilizing excess heat from industries. That's hard to use on a building by building solution level. So that's one recommendation from my side, is really to make national planning for the rollout of district heating to a much larger extent. One acceptance might be Sweden, actually, because that's the one country in our analysis which has a suitable level of district heating, but there's really a lack of district heating in general in Europe. So in terms of the local level, that's the last thing here to say. I'd just like to mention that we've described in one of the reports how that process can be done. And I won't go into the steps here, but I would just like to mention that even though you think you gather people, you make a plan and you apply some things and you make things happen, it's an iterative process. So you need to consider that this is something which will be ongoing. And this is one of the reasons why I think it could be a nice task for the local authorities to have the administrative role, which is also something that doesn't have to take a lot of money as investments, because it's not the municipality, for example, that needs to invest in the installation, but they need to invest some time in handling the process, because it's something that needs to be continued over the years. And with this, I can only urge you to look further into the reports, and otherwise you're free to ask questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, all of you, for this presentation. So now we will take the question. And dear participant, I invite you to ask your question on the chat. So if you have not seen it, it's in the back of your screen. If you move your mouse, you will be able to see a chat button, and then you can ask your question on the chat. So right now we don't have a question. So I think I will start with my question. It's really interesting to see that both of you are underlining the fact that social acceptance is really a key point. And maybe my first question will be for the FED project about the social acceptance. You said that sometimes this kind of marketplace is in fact giving less control to the people, to the owner of the house. And I'm wondering, how do you try to mitigate this problem and to make sure that people are comfortable with that? Do you have some end user interface which is more, I don't know, end user friendly or something like that?
Okay, this is Lars here speaking. Well, it's a difficult question, and it depends very much on what circumstances you're in. In the FED project, we're dealing with office spaces or a campus with customers rather than residents. So the challenge is perhaps not as big as if we were dealing with dwellers in their apartments and so on. But I think that information and trying to achieve what Daniel is speaking about, something that we're all in this together thing, but it has to be done. I think there's no silver bullet on how to do this, because it all depends on the historical situation and just what kind of freedom you're giving up. We have another project in the Göteborg Energi that illustrates this, where we try to smoothen out the peaks in the district heating system by letting the temperature vary very slightly within the houses. And there's this ongoing discussion, should we actually inform the end users of this or not? Because if you know that we are tampering with their indoor climate, perhaps people will react more than if they don't know. But on the other hand, if we're doing things that they don't know, there's a risk in that as well. So I think there's not one solution to this. We'll have to be dealing with it.
Yeah, sure. And the participants involved in this project, what are they feeling about that? What they will prefer?
You mean where the apartments?
Yeah.
We don't really know yet.
Okay.
We have quite positive experience in both cases, really. So it's still an open issue.
Okay, right. I think we have the first question from participant from Lena. This question is for Daniel. And what kind of feedback have you received on your reports, and how have they been used? So could you give us some insight about the result of your projects and the impact?
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a mix, I would say, in the reports I referred to today and the rest of the project, because we've tried to make sure that all key recommendations are aligned between various reports. And so we have brochure and these reports, and we have stakeholder meetings and what we call market uptake dialogue. So where we bring key stakeholders together and discuss if this is really what's helpful for them, or what is their experience. So far, I think it's been very positive, and we have gathered a few quotes actually from high-level policymakers being very positive on the outcome of the project. And we've also disseminated some of the key recommendations here to other stakeholders. So it seems like there's a good response on this. Seen local authorities using some of my pictures that's in his own presentation, so that's kind of a nice thing. But otherwise, you don't really we don't have a questionnaire on the website saying was this useful or not. So it's a small stories that we pick up on that when people mention something about the project, and it's
yeah, sure. Do you have maybe one next, let's say, workshop meeting or event if people would like to join already planned, or nothing at the moment?
Well, it's a bit of a pity because we just ended the project, but I think the outcome is also used in other projects as well, which is ongoing. There's both the reuse heat project I could mention, and
okay, thank you very much. I think maybe we can also mention the Euro Heat and Power Congress, annual Congress in May in Nantes in France. I think the topic will be, of course, discussed. If we go back to our topic of today, I don't know if we have more questions, not now. I have one other question regarding the DSO, because you said that right now the DSO don't have flexibility to operate, and I'm wondering if you see the development of the private grids as a solution to, let's try, avoid the constraint of this policy burden that we have now, because in your project the electrical grid is a private grid, isn't it?
That's true, yes.
Do you think that the development of the private grids could be a solution at the local level, or?
It's Lars speaking again, and personally, I'm not sure if that's the way to go. I think that there's a risk in creating sub-optimizations if we have different rules for different actors to a large extent. But I think that's also open to debate, and you can find people with different opinions. But I think that if you rather adjust the terms for what the DSO can do or not, I think that would be a more fruitful way of operating. But that's rather my personal view. I don't think Fed has an official point.
Okay, and this barrier is one of the main barriers if you want to roll out your marketplace in the whole city, no? At the moment.
Yes and no, because if we use the boundary of if we make Gothenburg into a local energy market, then then that boundary is more adjusted to the current legislation. So there are pros and cons in this. There are more rules to adhere to, but we don't risk the sub-optimization. So I would very much like to see a demonstration of the Fed on a municipality level.
Okay, and what are the main barriers to do so right now?
Well, it's a much bigger system.
Okay, so the question
for having it in a small scale in the early stages, we will learn what to do and what is cost efficient and not, and then try to extrapolate, I think.
Okay, sure. So one barrier is definitely the scale and the system itself, so more technical.
But also, Klaus here as well, there are also regulations that we identified for the DSO, how they can trade with flexibility. I mean, if it's a private grid or not, still it's the same case if you want to be able to trade with flexibility with the electrical grid. It's not so used in Sweden, and there are still some regulations about this as well. So otherwise, we are looking to the replication of Fed that you can do a lot at the moment, but perhaps some different business models, for example, trading of with flexibility with the DSO at the moment is a little bit blocked by regulation.
Yeah, but it is opening up.
Yeah, it's opening up.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's going in the good direction. We have another question from the audience, from Michael, and it's to everyone. For example, Daniel or Lars, do you have any recommendation for a city like Vienna, how to roll back an existing gas grid or to roll out the district heating, which is considered to be more expensive right now? And who would be interested to focus on this problem in a future project? I think, we have a lot of experts here who could help for this, for future project on this. So the question is, how do you roll back an existing gas grid? How do you disconnect from the gas grid?
This is Daniel. Of course, there could be limitations from national legislation that hinders this process, but I would say one part is to make this kind of long-term planning on what should the role of the gas grid be in 2050, for example, and try to bring the different stakeholders together and see if they can agree. Because it might be that it's fine to decrease the area with gas and then keep a certain area which is feeding high temperature industries, and then focus on decarbonizing that gas for those kind of processes. But in my perspective, and as far as my knowledge is that there will not be a feasible way that we can supply all the gas used today, including the future demands, with renewable gas. It's simply an unfeasible way. Of course, you can use electrolyzers and provide hydrogen, but it's just a very expensive way to provide 60 degrees hot water for residential housing. So we should use some green gas in the future, but it shouldn't really be for the individual households, as far as my concern is. Which means that it should be possible to make this kind of long-term planning and say, what should the role be, and try to agree on that and see where should you focus your efforts and where can we agree to disconnect the gas grids from the residential households. And I'm not sure how much the city of Vienna can decide on their own on this is our way forward. So we will apply suitable legislation that allows people to disconnect on say feasible way. Because if you can provide the district heating cheaper, then it should be fair enough to see if the market will go in that direction. But I'm not sure if there's some national legislation covering what is possible to do to disconnect in terms of the gas grids.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And maybe a reaction from our Fed expert on this topic. And what is the role of the gas in your fossil-free district energy district project right now? Do you use gas or not at all?
No, there's no gas in the Chalmers campus, but there is gas in the Gothenburg structure, and I wouldn't like to regard the gas grid as something, a liability or something, because I think every infrastructure is an asset, and like Daniel is saying, we have to discuss in a long-term perspective how to use this asset, or perhaps not use at all, but from a starting point, it is an asset. And in Sweden, we have a lot of discussions on the greening of gas. Already now, we have some 20% biogas in the gas grid at all. So I think we will need gas infrastructure to offload the electricity grid. We might not be able to have so many electric cars as people are thinking right now, so we might need natural gas or biogas for cars, just from a capacity point of view. And also we have industries that can't use electricity or district heating that easily within their processes. So I think we do need green gas, and I think we do need all the infrastructure to use that as much as we can.
Okay, all right.
Perspective from the Fed project is we mentioned that we have 3 utilities in that one: heating, cooling, and electricity. But of course, we could also add gas to the same system, same principle.
Yeah, because Fed is not to impose some specific kind of technology, not even district heating. It's about doing what you can with what you have in a smarter way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe I'm going back to Daniel's recommendation about the fossil fuel ban. Or the ban of the installation of fossil fuel boilers. Do you have an example of this at the local level, or a city which has done that, or do you think it's possible to do this at local level for, let's say, a bold mayor wanted to be very bold?
In Denmark, it has been done more on a national level. So I'm not aware of examples of local legislation going ahead of that. Mm-hmm. But I think it should be possible to some extent to decide on, especially if you have social housing or public buildings, that you decide what is in the tender. Well, I would like a building which is not fueled by fossil fuels. If that is one of the requirements, that's just still an open market for what kind of supply that should be, but just decide some prerequisites that rules out the fossil fuel option. I think it should be possible without, maybe you don't have to put this very strict rule to say fossil fuel is banned if you're not allowed to apply that kind of legislation, but you could still put in some requirements when you invest in something, or requirements when you subsidize something, that you make sure that you consider the climate aspects in all of that.
Yeah, sure. It seems really important, let's say, to propose some alternatives before putting some ban on some technology, because if the people don't have the alternative, or the alternative are too expensive, it could have some kind of backlash. So better to give incentive to the people, if I well understand what you are saying. And maybe another question, unless there are some questions from the audience. Other question from the audience is about the integrated energy planning, because you're saying that it's a key point, and it's important that it's done at local level too. I think some countries have more experience than others in this. I think in Denmark, you're quite experienced in this, and now we are seeing that, for example, in Scotland, all the local authorities will have to develop some heating and cooling strategies, as well as in the Netherlands. Maybe could you give us some more example about how it's done in some country, or for example in Denmark?
Well, it's as mentioned, it's been done for decades. I think more than 40 years now, since the first ones, and it is. It doesn't have to be very, very comprehensive in the first round, I would say. So looking at an area and considering what are my options here. Is it relevant with district heating, or is it far out in the countryside? If it is too low density of heat demand, then okay, what other options have we? Can we make individual heat pumps, and how could the ownership of that kind of heat pumps be? Because you have different options there as well. But I mean, the starting point of such local planning is actually some of the things we developed in the Heat Robot Bureau project with the beta map, meaning that you look at the area, consider the heat demands, and think about, okay, if we want to develop district heating, how far away should we go from the city center, and what would the cost be, and how many people should be connected before it's not feasible anymore. So there's a connection rate you also need to reach before investing in district heating, for example. But we do have some fairly concrete examples described in the report for the local level recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. So maybe we are close to the end of our webinar. So if you have a last question, please do not hesitate to ask. And I will still ask another question about the scale to approach the energy transition, because all of them said we should not think at the building level, because this building level is not always a good one, because we want to have an integrated energy system, and to make sure we are decarbonizing everything, not one house and leaving the other house using fossil fuel. What would be your recommendation? Is the district level the good scale to approach at the transition, or is it more the city scale? Yeah, my question would be, what would be the scale, the good scale to approach the energy transition?
Lars here. I think there's not one answer to this question. You need to address different things on different scales, but it's always important to think globally and act locally, because you're constrained with what you can do locally. If you have your own house and if you're building a building, you should have building codes, but ensures that you make good buildings. Then now, when we create the energy infrastructure in a city, of course we have to think on a city level, but we always need to think about the global consequences. Otherwise we tend to sub-optimize. Like often in Swedish context, we're driven to use more electricity due to building codes and such, because of the system boundary issues is not resolved in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much to everyone to attend this Celsius talk. And I would like to mention that there will be other webinar of